Okay, in the studio to talk about airport concessioning is the Managing Director at Topbrass Aviation, Captain Rowland Iyayi. It's good to have you on TVC Breakfast this morning. Of course, his former MD, NEMA, that's Nigerian Airports Management Authority. Agency. Okay, thanks for that. Now, Nigerian airports have been described as lacking in the most basic facilities for enjoyable overall airport enjoyment. Is that apt?
Well, to a large extent, I think what we have as airports, ideally, if you look at the history of aviation in Nigeria, have evolved from what you would consider to be airfields in the days past. Unfortunately, when you do not have a wholesale or holistic plan, as it were, for developing an airport in such a way that it can provide for future growth, you get to a point where the airport reaches a limit, and when it reaches a limit such that it can no longer grow, and you continue to have sort of an increased throughput capacity in terms of number of passengers, then of course the level of convenience of facilities that you would have will become constrained, in the sense that what we had that was planned for, say, 1 million passengers is now being used by 5 million passengers. So what you end up with is a sort of an inconvenience, as it were, to the passengers. Let me take a very basic example. When you look at the terminal buildings, you get into the terminal buildings, from walking from the outside to the inside, the ambience is pretty much not any different. I mean, the air conditioning probably is not working very well, and that's because over the years, I mean, take Murtala Mohammed Airport. This was 1976. The air conditioning we have at the airport was designed to be a central air conditioning system. For a long time, it was sort of abandoned in terms of maintenance. For a while, when Peter Igbinedion became the FAN MD, by the time he took over, the coolers we had for the airport, I think about 4 or 5 of them, had broken down completely. He was able to revive, I think it was 2 of them, but because the particular equipment at the time had to be referred, in terms of spare support, had to go back to the original manufacturers, and they don't at this point manufacture the same type of equipment. Right. The airport authority has had to resort to having to make do with split unit air conditioning. Now, when you look at the volume of the terminal building, have we actually taken cognizance of the actual volume to look at what would be apt in terms of the volume to be cooled by these units? Do we have the numbers adequate to be able to effectively cool these units? So you find a lot of constraints, and I think if you take it back, it boils down to a lot of a short-sightedness in terms of planning.
All right. Okay, so the government's plan to concession 4 of this major airports, do you think is a step to redress some of these anomalies you're talking about?
Absolutely. I mean, let's be frank. Airport management is an art form. And do we have the expertise? I mean, that we have people working in the Federal Airports Authority of Nigeria does not mean that they were adequately trained in terms of airport management. Okay. What we've had over the years is, most government parastatals have been used by successive governments for patronage.
So what you're saying is that the airports really have just been manned by people who hardly have the skills or the required skills. It's just been run like some ministry.
The necessary skill sets do not exist, as it were, to a large extent. I mean, a lot of people get trained on the job. Now, if you have the right experts, the right people manning, the various areas of the airports, for instance, we would have less reliance, on, some of the knee-jerk sort of actions we take in terms of addressing crisis. Let me give you an example. In major airports all over the world, airports scarcely rely on what you call aeronautical revenues.
What would that be?
Aeronautical revenues are revenues derivable from airline operations like landing, parking, and all the rest of it. For major successful airports in the world, you have a sort of 70% to 80% of their revenues will come from what you call non-aeronautical revenues, whilst 20 or 30% of it will come from aeronautical revenues. But in Nigeria, it's lopsided. What we have is a situation where airlines have to carry the burden to a large extent. FAN today would have a breakdown of its earnings, probably about 60–70% aeronautical revenues, whilst 30 will be non-aeronautical revenues. What it means is that you have a major burden on airlines. And when you talk about airlines not being successful, they carry the burden of sustaining these airports. Unfortunately, because of the structure of our industry, only 4 or 5 airports in Nigeria account for predominantly 85% of the total traffic in the country. Wow. So what we have had over the years is a situation where people say we have so-called unviable airports. I disagree. The reason the airports are not viable is not because they cannot be viable. It's because the policy framework do not sustain viability. And I'll give you a reason why. When airlines get licensed, you know, you're required to say, for instance, where your base of operations will be.
Yes.
Now, typically a lot of airlines in days past, they want to be where the passengers are. And for them, it's either Lagos, Abuja, Port Harcourt. I mean, amongst these 3 airports, you have 80.2% of the total traffic. So you have a concentration of traffic there. But the problem is, even though you have this concentration of traffic amongst these 3 airports, it is not to say that the airlines flying in these markets are viable themselves. Why? Because you have what you call, at this present time, destructive competition in the market.
Okay.
That is, you have a lot of airlines throwing so much capacity into these markets. But unfortunately, you know, when they seem to have made a lot of money when they have good loads, during the day when they have poor yields in the off-peak periods, they dilute the load. So at the end of the day, airlines show presence in the markets, but they're not making money.
See, the picture you're painting here is that the airline industry in Nigeria is really not that lucrative. So why it looks like, you know, so many people are just, you know, going into that sector?
But unfortunately,
what exactly is the attraction then?
Well, the truth of the matter is that the airport and the airport and the airline assets actually are critical infrastructure to economic growth. If you do not have these assets, you do not have access to markets. When you do not have access to markets, there's hardly any way you can, you know, encourage FDIs. When you do not have FDIs, you don't grow your economy. When you do not grow your economy, we have what we have at this present time, which is called stagflation.
Indeed.
So when you look at it, it's a critical component.
It is.
But the point is, it needs to be addressed holistically. We cannot take one element of it and leave the other parts of it.
Okay, let's talk about the issue of revenue generation as regards the declaration of a viable statement of account by FAN. There are allegations that for some years now there hadn't been anything like that coming from FAN. Is it true?
Well, I do not have the facts, but I could tell you when I was in government, it was evident that you know, the various agencies of government in aviation at the time did not have current audited accounts, which is a requirement on an annual basis. In 2006, I had that conducted for NAMA, but subsequently, I don't know what's happened. But the fact of the matter is, I can say for a fact, as of 2006, that's about a decade ago, a lot of all the agencies in aviation did not have you know, current audited accounts to tell you exactly what you have in terms of, you know, if we have holes there or we have a viable entity. That we would never know. We can never tell until we have that.
Okay, we'll continue this discussion. Of course, that will be after we give you, you know, further background to the issue we're discussing right now. Now, for decades, Nigerian airports, well, now just jumping the whole thing. Nigeria has 26 airports, and of the 26, only 3 of them, namely Lagos, Abuja, and Port Harcourt, account for 80%. Of course, like you heard from our guest, that's 80% of the total public traveling by air. And these airports are controlled by the federal government. Recently, the aviation minister announced plans to privatize 4 of the country's main airports. And The ones picked are Lagos, Abuja, Port Harcourt and Kano airports, and that move continues to generate, well, some kind of controversy.
Rotimi Amechi has explained that the essence of the planned concession was to guarantee efficiency and good management in view of limited resources at the disposal of the federal government for infrastructural development in the aviation industry. And like our guest said, of course, this is very important to bring in foreign direct investment into the country. And from what we had yesterday, the number of outflows out of Nigeria is more than what is coming in. Okay, so good airports will also just increase the fortune of Nigeria. But that may not happen anytime soon, at least not until after government is done with the construction of terminals at the 4 airports.
Now, with the new plan, the Murtala International Airport is expected to generate additional million passengers annually, while the remaining 3, Abuja, Port Harcourt and Kano, will generate the remaining 15 million to make up 30 million. Okay, now let's take a look at a few countries that have privatized their airports. Ghana, for instance, has attempted a series of private partnership transactions to improve major airports such as Kotoka Airport in Accra, which is the only international one, and Tamale Airport, where a USD, that's $100 million deal was just signed, as well as the construction of airports at Princess Town and Kafu, again with the assistance of private funding.
There is some scope for further privatization of airports in South Africa outside of the state-owned system. The existing ones include Larisiria, which are between Johannesburg and Pretoria, and the Kruger National Park Airport. Private capital has been also sought for the construction of permanent and interim terminals in Kenya's Nairobi, that's Jomo Kenyatta Airport in North Africa. An extremely large construction project is planned to create an airport city at Cairo Airport in Egypt, with many, which may cost up to $14.5 billion.
Now, the Ministry of Finance is seeking additional foreign investment for the project. Those are open examples. Let's look at what some of the critics of this privatization process are worried about. Number one, some experts say it would be better to privatize the remaining 17 airports than to privatize the leading 4. Some are also worried that private companies would not manage the airports better. They are also worried that the airports would be sold to friends and associates.
And those in government.
And those in government.
Okay, so that really...
do you have such concerns about this privatization?
Well, incidentally, I mean, we talked about this in the last 12 months. My view is that the airports really and truly should be concessioned. Because when you do that, you would actually have very good fiscal discipline and accountability to a large extent.
You mean all the airports?
All the airports.
Some are saying that the 4 major airports, Lagos, Port Harcourt, Kano...
The proposal that, for instance, I presented a paper to the transition committee, and the presentation dwelled on the fact that we have 5 blocks that we can have in the country. We have 5 international airports in the country, namely Lagos, Port Harcourt, Abuja, Kano, and Enugu. Enugu is now an international airport. We have, on a daily basis, we have Ethiopian Airlines flying into Enugu at this point. Now, my view is this: if government really wants to privatize or concession the airports, as it were, yes, they can do that in 5 blocks. Okay. But I think there's a need to also establish clearly that the companies that will be allowed this concession, or the concessionaires, would be airport companies, reputable airport companies from known all around the world, with some credibility to them, in the sense that there's a track record of success wherever they are. They can bring that expertise to bear on the Nigerian scene. Now, they'll do it in such a way that if you take one international airport, like Lagos for instance, you would insist that the concessionaire would take on 2 or 3 more secondary airports.
So within the axis, like Ibadan?
It doesn't necessarily mean anywhere within the country.
Okay.
And it's better anywhere within the country, so you don't have cartel blocks building up, because that itself can create a sort of rent-seeking.
Is that similar to what Argentina is doing? It's something like a clustering? Is it the same?
Yeah, you can cluster, but you don't cluster typically to regions. That can create cartels. And when you have a cartel situation, it becomes rent-seeking. And ultimately it becomes adversely impacting to your industry. You don't need that. What you need essentially is to have blocks, yes, but the blocks will be that they spread in the different geographical zones. So whoever is holding on a Lagos, for instance, can have maybe a Katsina and maybe a Yola. What you end up doing is to spread is to sort of ward off any possibility of rent seeking that can also adversely impact the industry. And I think if the government goes along with that, it can be done. Yes, there's a fear that it can be done as it's been done in certain other industries in the country, where you talk about privatization and you find that people close to government turn out to be the owners of these assets.
And don't forget that Oronsaye report actually suggested this concession in a couple years back. Why was it ignored then?
I think the issue has always been the structure and the implementation. And of course, I mean, I said this one time before, there would always be interest. However you want to look at it, there will be interest. But how do we make sure that national interest
comes first?
And that's the key. And for me, I think it's doable. Like I said, if it's an international bid, where you have reputable airport companies coming in and saying, look, we have belief in the Nigerian market. We have belief in what this market represents globally and regionally. Therefore, we're going to invest. When you bring in concessionaires, knowing the volume of traffic, that is the potential volume of traffic, and the strategic nature of where the country is located, we can actually see people who would invest their hard-earned money in the sector, and it will take away completely a lot of a burden of government on an annual basis.
Let me ask you before we go off TVC entertainment.
Right.
These airports that we call international, are they really, really international, or just international on paper? I mean, when you compare with Heathrow, for example, or Gatwick, that incidentally is owned by Nigerian.
No, it's not owned by Nigerian.
Or run by Nigerian.
A Nigerian is the concessionaire to Gatwick.
Yes, but that's interesting.
Well, the thing is, he's an equity fund person, so he can get the funds to invest and get the right expertise into those airports. We have international airports, but what we have not had is, I'll give you an example. Heathrow, for instance, they have two main runways. They're talking about a third runway. The only reason they can have a third runway is because somebody 20 years ago projected that, what if we grew this airport to 100 million passengers per annum? How do we cope with it? So in planning ahead, you start talking about the potential for growth. And most international airports are scalable if the planning is done right. You start from where you are, projecting for say 5-10 million passengers per annum, and then you look at it that once you're now hitting the target, before then, you start expanding the facilities to cope with the growth that you anticipate. Dubai, for instance, just opened a new terminal because they're thinking of 100 million passengers per annum. So these are things you look at in the long term, not the short term.
Okay. All right, we'll continue this interview, but for our viewers on TVC Entertainment, our TVC Breakfast continues on TVC Nigeria Concert Channel 190. DSTV, it is 418, GoTV 45, and ACTV, click on 5110.
All right, welcome back. We're still looking at the privatization plan of Nigerian airports, and we have Rowland Iyayi, former MD NEMA, right here in the studio with us. Over the years, there have been attempts to rehabilitate the airports, especially within the last decade. Are you saying all of those attempts were really just a waste of public funds? Like people have said, government has no business actually being involved in the airports.
Well, let's say this. When you go into an airport as a passenger, what are the things you look for? If I return from an international flight, and the ICAO standard is, your facilitation must be done from the planing to exiting the airport a maximum of 30 minutes. Now, how many times do you return from an international trip or a domestic trip, as a matter of fact, and you're within that airport premises for longer than 30 minutes? Now, the passenger throughput capacity of an airport is built or is designed to take cognizance of the fact that you want to make sure people come and go through that facility we haven't taken cognizance of the real things that we need to work on in our airports to ensure this happens. When you design fantastic buildings for airports, that's fine, but it's not the edifice that makes the airport. It's the infrastructure, it's the equipment that you have on ground to ensure that you can facilitate and meet with ICAO standards. I'll give you an example. 30 minutes is a throughput time that we're talking about. Now, if the baggage will come off the airplane and get to the conveyor belts, and you can go through the immigration process and everything and come out, be there to pick up your bags and walk out, I'm almost certain if you don't have all the long queues at the point of immigration status and at the point of the customs and all the rest of it, you'd find that all of this probably can be done. But what we had for airports that we talked about, airport remodeling project, for me was cosmetic. If you take Kotoko International Airport, you're talking about in Ghana, it was built in 1964. But if you fly through Kotoko today, I can guarantee you do less than 20 minutes. I've tried it. And that is because they focused on the right things to get done. They have had more passengers over the years, but they didn't change the buildings. Okay. All they did was to ensure that the equipment that would facilitate passengers are optimal. And that's what they've done. Right. But what we have done in our case, we've cladded airports with aluminum and all the rest of it. They look good, but that is not the real issue. The real issue is the main stuff that you do at the background. That's what really makes the airport. Okay.
Interestingly, we're talking about what efforts that have been put in place in the past. Let's talk about just recent remodeling of the airport that got in about 150 billion or million naira.
Well, I don't have the numbers.
Okay, fine. And thereabout, according to the reports that we got. Now, if the government concessions at this airport, what happens to this money? Some people are kicking against it that for now, some of these contractors are not yet paid. What happens?
Well, again, I think there's a lot of controversy regarding what was done or what wasn't done. For instance, the aviation industry, when the last minister before he left, Osita Chidoka, had indicated that the industry was owing 84 billion. Wow. I'm not sure what the actual number is today, but that was what he said. Now, 84 billion for what? We need to ask the question. Now, I'm aware, for instance, that contracts were awarded for a variety of things in the last 3 years for all the airports to have different facilities and assets to be brought in. But have they been done? Have monies been paid? Now, these are things that we need to establish. Now, for me, you know, it boils back to the same thing we talk about, fiscal discipline and transparency. If government would, on an annual basis, I mean, I don't know what the budget of fund is today, but I see it as a sink. Because if the government would take, I don't know how much, 10 billion, 20 billion, 30 billion, and drive into the airports today on an annual basis, I think is a waste. There's a right now, as we speak, there's a competition, you know, amongst the critical areas of the economy for the scarce fiscal resources.
Indeed.
So if the government is going to say that, listen, we need to do this right, and we know that critical infrastructure is key to whatever progress and growth we need for this economy, the government doesn't have the resource to do it. So it's very key and it's important, it's imperative that we start looking towards the private sector to get involved.
Yes,
and that's why the essence of the
coming
concession.
in now, they are coming in and they are
when you concession,
inherit a lot of. So what happens?
When you concession the airports, the government will earn income because the concessionaires coming in will pay government some money. The fear has always been, and I think what the, I mean, I've read a lot of people say that, oh, when you bring in all these concessionaires, they will sack people. I'm sorry, that will happen.
Is that genuine concern? It will happen.
It will happen, but it's not it's not on the scale that people have said. I'll give you an example. The Minister of State Aviation, at a presentation to the stakeholders about a month ago, had talked about the fact that there was a need to set up a transportation security agency, more like a TSA in America.
Okay.
Now, what we have equivalent to that today is a FAN aviation security personnel. If I'm not mistaken, These individuals constitute about 25% of the total population of FAN. When you take that number out of FAN, and my view is, set up what you call a Nigerian Aviation Security Corps, because aviation security today has been taken away from a civil regime to a paramilitary regime because of all the security issues we have worldwide. When you take that number out, I don't know what the total population of FAN is today, but I can guarantee you that that's 25% of the population gone. So you're left with 75%. If you bring in airport concessionaires and you tell them that, look, if you take this airport, you take these other airports with it, you will be mandated to keep 60% of the staff at those airports.
Okay.
What you're left with is 15%. Now, 15%, I can guarantee you another 5% of FAN staff today are due for retirement. From the concessioning, the government can earn enough money to pay off, what's due the retirees.
Is the MM2 concessioning to
By Courtney.
Yeah,
that's
by
correct.
Courtney.
That's
Is it a good example of what can happen if we actually privatize our airports?
If it was done right, absolutely. Why? I mean, the consortium by Courtney has invested tremendous amount of money. They've gone out to the public funds to get funding to put the edifice you find in place. Unfortunately, they've had bottlenecks. They've come up with all manner of resistance, and that's simply because it's not business as usual. If you take by Courtney Terminal and you take the GAT and look at it seriously, you tell me which of the two you find more convenient to travel through.
Okay.
And that's because the efficiencies that are built in with a private entrepreneur is not the same thing you get with government.
All right, let's quickly look at the microeconomic policies that we have today. Is it good for private sector to be, if the government concessions, right? Do you think the private sector would have access to credit? There's a tremor going on in the banking industry as we speak. Remember, after the power sector privatization, the bank they were weighed down with quite a huge number of loans, non-performing loan, as it were. Do you foresee that in this process?
Aviation is international. And like I said, when you bring in, reputable airport companies, not Rowland Iyayi and Sons, you will end up having people who have access to cheap funds. They're looking at equity that they can get from sources internationally. I mean, the airport infrastructure is like a mortgage. The Nigerian banks do not have the capacity to give you a funding that would support an infrastructure like that over the next 25 years. Banks will tell you, we can give you a loan, but we'll give you 5 years. It's part of our problems that by Courtney had, because it took out a consortium of our local bankers. And the tenor of the loan was not even good for a mortgage. Building an airport is like taking a mortgage facility. And it has to be for a long period of time, because you need to amortize that investment over a long period of time, not a 5-year tenor. I mean, concessioning will be between 15 and 25 years, depending on the structure. So again, when you concession and you bring in reputable organizations, they will bring in the equity, because if you give them the right framework, they can get the funding.
Okay, we're pressed for time. Finally, should this privatization be total, or is there any aspect that government should still be involved in with the airports?
My view is, I think it should be total, but you see, if you concession the airports in blocks, and you're talking about all the airports, set out a program to phase out the Federal Airports Authority of Nigeria over a 24-year period. In that period, you can close out entirely on your concessioning plan.
All right.
Set up a new company called the Nigerian Airports Company, or whatever you want to call it. And this company will be the holding company and the company that would manage the concessioning agreements with all these concessionaires. So what you now do is take out all the assets in FAN and put it in the new company. And the new company will enter into agreements with the concessionaires, and they will manage it over the tenure of that.
Okay, we'll have to leave it there. Rowland Iyayi, former MD, NEMA, it's been nice talking with you this morning
Thank you
on the airports and, of course, privatization in Nigeria.